came all the way from D.C. today. It's a woman named Phyllis Bennis to talk about Connie and WESPAC. Phyllis is a, or perhaps the, preeminent fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington and at the Amsterdam-based Transnational Institute. As all of you may know already, she's a longtime peace and justice activist, working with the movements for Palestinian rights, ending U.S. wars, and changing U.S. foreign policy more broadly. From a think tank we can proudly call our own, please welcome Phyllis Bennis.
Obligations that Connie has left us with. I wasn't sure I was going to make it up there in time. But what I really want to know, Amy, how'd you get that dog on the train? I would have brought my Oscar, but he's like 3 times that size. He was at the big El Salvador demonstration. That's his job. You know, Connie's life parallels in many ways the movements, the progressive movements of the last, I think, 80 years. And I've only known her and her work and been around those movements for maybe 50 years, so I'm like a generation behind. But boy, is there a lot of work to do to catch up. You know, at IPS, we were thinking a lot this week about our great friend Harry Belafonte, who just passed. Harry was on our board, and many of us had the opportunity to work with him on a number of projects. It was a gift. And he and Connie were, in many ways, very much alike. Not in a whole host of ways. They were not alike at all. But they shared, among other things, the commitment to young people, to the next generations, to bringing people with them, to never just doing stuff themselves. It always had to be with other people. And it's an extraordinary notion. The notion of Connie as the conscience of White Plains. That's what one of the local papers called her at some point. I think they said it in a kind of sarcastic, you know, sort of really she's the conscience of the community. But yeah, she was. And she made this community, I was going to say that she made it better, but she didn't make it better. She enabled whole communities of people to make this a better place in terms of all of the evils of racism and poverty and injustice and support for war and dealing with the climate in all of those ways. Connie was there. She was insisting on responding to that recognition that she needed to, she saw that there was a crisis. And she said, okay, we've got work to do. Let's go out and do that work. Pete Seeger called her the indefatigable organizer. And coming from Pete, that's a hell of a statement, right? Talk about indefatigable, but it's one of those words that actually nobody should ever try and say that. But this question of whose shoulders do we stand on? You know, many of us here who are now the elders of our movement. I've got to say, the first time somebody introduced me that way, I was turning around and saying, what? That's not me? It's like, yeah, well, it is now. But those of us from our generation, we know whose shoulders we stand on. We stand on the shoulders of Connie Hogarth. We stand on the shoulders of Harry Belafonte. We stand on the shoulders of a generation of heroes who fought in Spain, who went south with the Freedom Riders, who defended the Rosenbergs, who represented the unions, who fought against the blacklist. They were heroes. I sometimes think about my first interactions with some of those on whose shoulders I had stood for so long, but at that time, as a 17, 18-year-old kid, boy, did I not know that. And I cringe at what I thought. But that notion of standing on the shoulders of those who have gone before and bringing along those who come for the future. That's what Connie was all about. That's what she was all about. You know, Connie, I have a feeling that between Amy and Leslie and Pat and Sandy, there's not a whole lot more I can say about Connie that you haven't heard all your lives. And know yourselves and just heard in the last hour and a half while I was struggling to get all the way on the train. But this notion that she was arrested in the early period of the anti-war protests around Vietnam, which when I was growing up through junior high and high school into that, it seemed like it had been going on forever. Yeah. When we look back in comparison, it was a war that lasted 10 years in terms of large-scale U.S. engagement. That's nothing compared to what we're seeing in permanent wars. But in that early period, that was, as we just heard from Amy, the die-in in Washington, the first of the die-ins, which became a regular feature of protests of all of our movements. And moving forward, Connie was part of that movement for so many years, for so long, and understood how it linked to the civil rights movement, because war is linked to racism. War is linked to the destruction of climate. War is linked to poverty, because then, as now, more than half of the discretionary federal budget goes directly to the military. And Connie was always among those reminding us of that, and saying you can't not talk about poverty. When I hear these words from Reverend Barber, who I work closely with now from the Poor People's Campaign, who talks about the evils of Martin Luther King Jr.'s evil triplets, racism, poverty, and militarism, and said, and if Dr. King were here today, he would of course add climate, as Connie did. This intersectional notion of what our movements have to fight against and who we are in solidarity with, what other movements are there for us to work with. That's all of what we continue to take away from our time with Connie. The notion that she was able to celebrate the end of the war on today, April 30th. I don't know if other people have talked about that yet. I missed the beginning part. April 30th is the anniversary of the end of the war in Vietnam. The day the Vietnamese won back their liberation and freedom. April 30th, 1975. I remember the day because I was working at the time in Sioux Falls, South Dakota on a legal team representing a group coming out of the AIM struggle against the occupation of Wounded Knee. And there was a sense that night when we watched that famous scene with Walter Cronkite, the conscience of the world, taking off his glasses and looking very serious around. I can't do that because I'm blind to the ballot. He looked around and said, I'm sorry to have to tell you that Saigon has just fallen. And we thought, no, Saigon is rising. Saigon is rising because it was an occupation that was ending. It was a war that was ending that was not for the people of Vietnam. It certainly was not for the people of the United States. It was for rubber plantations and billionaires and the Pentagon. And we were thrilled and we were excited and ran down to buy champagne to celebrate, and then suddenly realized we were in a community who probably did not share our view. But it was an amazing moment, and when I came back, I still didn't know Connie at that time, but I knew the Connie Hogarths all over this country who were leading the local protest movements that together had created this extraordinary national movement that we call the movement against the war in Vietnam, the anti-war movement. There were Connie Hogarths all over the country. Our Connie was just kind of the best of them. But she wasn't the only one. She wasn't the only one. And lots of them knew her and learned from her. And she learned from others as well, because it comes back to this thing of on whose shoulders do we stand? We're all standing on each other's shoulders. The other thing that I think was so important that I think Connie learned in that early period of the Vietnam War movement was that there's a huge movement in this country. In that case, it was to get the troops out, to end the war, get the troops home. And that was the call of the movement as a whole. But within the movement, there was a core of people whose understanding of internationalism and solidarity went beyond simply saying, get the troops out, to say, we stand with those on the other side. We stand with those who are fighting for the liberation of their country, for a social program that means the rights of women, the rights to protect the environment. All are part of what we're fighting for. They were fighting for socialism. And Connie was part of that. And her understanding and the richness of her understanding of internationalism meant that that was her framework. Whether she was working on East Timor, it wasn't just about stopping the sale and gift of arms to the Indonesian army. It was about standing with the people of East Timor as they fought for their own liberation. It was the same thing in South Africa. It was partly about getting the US to stop collaborating with the apartheid regime in South Africa and Namibia. That was huge. But it was also standing with the people of South Africa, standing with the ANC, to say, this is my struggle too. As you struggle for a South Africa for all your people, you are struggling for all of us around the world. And Connie's work against apartheid in South Africa had that at its core and its root. The same thing was true for Palestine, where Connie took up the struggle for Palestinian rights in the mid to late 1980s, when it was way not popular to do so, when it was a really hard thing. And it was not only that she took it on and said, yeah, of course we have to take up Palestinian rights at WESPAC, because it's part of the struggle for liberation, it's part of the end to colonization around the world, that all of these struggles are linked. But being Connie, she went beyond that as well, and said, this is not always the case. I think if Connie were with us today to talk about Ukraine, she would also be saying, our job is to say, end this war. End this war. We need negotiations. We need a ceasefire. Our job is not to stand militarily. That's a hard position. And Connie took a lot of hard positions. She took the position of supporting Palestinian rights because it was the right thing to do, not because it was popular. I met Connie for the first time after hearing a lot about her when I moved to New York by that time. But I lived in New York, I guess, for about 2 years before I ever met her. And I met her in Jerusalem. I met her at the National, what's it called? The Grand National Palace Hotel in occupied East Jerusalem. She was there with the delegation. I was there working on a book about the First Intifada. And we threw our arms around each other. Oh, you're, and we were sisters from then on. We were comrades, we were friends. I had many nights in the downstairs room, and she was always so excited that Pat and Sandy were here just yesterday. You just missed them. I'm like, oh God, why didn't you tell me that? I would have come yesterday. But it was always part of what Connie did. And then there was the question of how she did the work around Palestine in the context of WESPAC. And one part of that was to say, this shouldn't be treated as something harder than everything else, that's marginal to everything else. This is a normal part of our work. To normalize the issue of Palestinian rights in the context of a broad progressive movement when people were very, very supportive of lots of people's rights, but with that one exception. It was easy. It was easy to be progressive except Palestine. Connie was never willing to accept that. It wasn't like she fought with people. She kind of left that to me sometimes. But she was always willing to talk with people as long as it took. She would talk into the night about, it's not just about the emotional attachment here or there. We have to look at what's real. We have to look at where people are struggling for liberation and where we, our government, our tax dollars, our military, are responsible. And she was never prepared to just stand back and say, it's okay if you're progressive on most things. That was never okay. She was never one to check boxes and say, until you can check every box, you can't come to our protests. Connie did not have a sectarian bone in her body. And she dealt with a lot of people who did, I gotta say. But she had a way of being clear that it's not about making people sign off on this petition or that sign-on letter before you can be considered part of the movement. Everybody is part of the movement when they do anything for justice. But it's our job as organizers to make sure it doesn't stop there. That's step one. That's not step last. So we always have a ton of work to do in all of these movements. And as we became friends over those years, in the houses on the river, the house in Hastings and then the house in Beacon, I started to see these passions of Connie and how they fit together. She had three, besides all of those that I just talked about, she had three other amazing passions. She had a passion for internationalism in the UN, making the UN into something better than it was, but for internationalism as something that had to be at the root of our movement as much as anti-racism and anti-sexism and concern for the climate and all those other things. Why did I say climate? But she also had a specific passion for the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. It was the essence of justice. And it was something that, as we know, around the world, this was a movement that moved people who had never moved before in a progressive direction. It was so clear. The evil of apartheid was so indefensible. There was no pro-apartheid lobby in the United States. There was plenty of money supporting apartheid in the United States, but they never had the nerve to come out. They never had the nerve to come out and try to debate with the anti-apartheid movement. Nobody could do that. And Connie was at the core of all of that. I'll have another story of being in Connie's house at, I think it was 3 o'clock in the morning. We were in the midst of this campaign that had to do with the United Nations, and had to do with the anti-apartheid movement and the Iraq War. It had to do with an effort that we were making very privately to bring Nelson Mandela to shame the Security Council. We thought if anything could stop this war, the Security Council, if they were shamed, maybe could do something. And who in the world could shame the United Nations Security Council other than Nelson Mandela? And it was a whole complicated story, which I won't get into, but it involved people from South Africa, it involved some diplomats, and it involved Harry Belafonte. His job, he had a very important job. He had to get through the gatekeepers of President Mandela's office, which was known to be an impossible task, because they were very, very protected. Nobody who worked in his office wanted anybody to ask him to do anything that was going to take any more of his energy. People were so protected. Only Harry was able to get through. And he got through, and he was calling me to tell me, and he was somewhere, I don't know where he was, but he wasn't in the same time zone. I was in the same time zone, but I wasn't home. I was at Connie's house. And Harry called me at like 3 o'clock in the morning to say, we got approval. And I was like, oh my God. And then the next thing he said was, oh, I'm so sorry, did I wake you up? And I said, Harry, do you know how many people there are in this world who would give their eye teeth to hear your voice at 8 o'clock? It's a lovely moment that was. But Connie was part of all of that kind of work. She was part of the behind-the-scenes work, and she was out there with a bullhorn leading the chants, and everywhere in between. She was part of the reason that the banks in Westchester pulled their money out of apartheid South Africa. She was part of what built the ties, the sister city ties, with cities in South Africa, with settlements in South Africa. All of that was part of it. Her other great passion, stopping nuclear weapons. And thankfully, Connie did get to see the closing down of Indian Point. At least that. And I think that all of the arrests and the sit-ins and the die-ins and the education and the teachings that Connie helped us lead all those years was a huge part of what suppressed that nuclear danger for a long time. And now we have a ton of work to do in Connie's name, because right now we have never been at risk to the degree that we are at risk right now. The reason for saying that we need immediate ceasefire and immediate negotiations in Ukraine is not only because too many Ukrainians are dying today. It's because this war, unlike earlier horrifying wars, unlike the war in Afghanistan, unlike the war in Iraq, even unlike the war in Syria, where the US and Russian troops and pilots and planes were there on opposite sides challenging each other. It was a very dangerous moment. But not one of those wars had the possibility of this current war of leading to a nuclear escalation. And I think if Connie was here, she would say, get out there and do it. Get out there and start that mobilization again. and so many other passions. The passion for the climate, and particularly for the Hudson River. Her ties with Pete and Toshi was so bound up with protection of the river and singing the songs of the river, singing the songs of children being able to swim in the river for the first time. All of those things link back to the damage that's being done by the current war in Ukraine. Damage to certainly the Ukraine environment, but threatening the environment around the world, just like it's threatening greater hunger and famine around the world as a result of this war. And the question, her other passion, of mentoring young people. And this is where I've had Connie and Harry in my mind all week. Because of the work that both of them did with generations, recognizing the generations on whose shoulders they stood, and recognizing the generations that have come along. What Connie has done with the creation of WESPAC, the building of WESPAC, and the turning over of WESPAC to a new generation, to continue its work on Palestine, to continue its work on justice, on fighting racism, on fighting for the planet. All of that is part of the job of the next generation. And Connie understood that from the very moment that she created that organization. She knew that the part of it was going to be, how do I transition to the next one? And when Manhattanville College built the Connie Hogarth Center for Social Justice, that's what that was all about. It wasn't about having something with Connie's name on it. It was about having young kids who were going to learn from the best, who were going to learn how to be troublemakers and agitators and activists in the best possible way. When Reverend Barber called me a few months ago to tell me about his latest plot, which he'd been working on for a year, which is the opening of the new, see if I get the title right, the Center for People's Theology and People's Policy. That's it, I think, something like that. The idea is for Reverend Barber and Reverend Liz and the other incredible organizers of the Poor People's Campaign and the Repairers of the Breach to train up a new generation of, in their case, faith-based activists to be the troublemakers in the churches and to use the credentials of the churches to be troublemakers everywhere, in Congress and everywhere else where power lies. And the mentoring of those young people is very much at the root of what all of this is about. So everything that Connie loved, the music, her ties with Pete and Toshi, her adoration for Emma's Revolution, she brought national organizing to a local committee, to a local community. And she brought the understanding and the grounding of that local community to the national environment in which Connie worked as well. And she leaves behind so much. She leaves behind a Westchester better than it ever would have been. She leaves behind a WESPAC with an incredible staff, an incredible board, an incredible action, policy work to change the world. There are fewer power plants than there would have been. There's a generation who, at least on some level, understands the need to link opposition to nuclear power and nuclear weapons with their broader opposition to what's being done to the climate in their name. She's brought up a generation of agitators and organizers and troublemakers, all in her name. And we're grateful.
Mentioned the personal and the political, but I think that all comes together in the themes of what we've all heard. And to continue that conversation of the personal and the political, I'd like to invite Andrew Courtney to the stage to make a few comments.